Hi, everybody. Welcome back. My name is Emilio Santiago. I am here currently in snowy English Camp unit of San Juan Island National Historical Park. One of our cultural landscapes, actually, this park, San Juan Island National Historical Park, on this beautiful San Juans. Three cultural landscapes. It's actually 37% of park lands here. So this is a topic I'm very excited about. I am the Cultural Resources Program here at the park. I like to make that joke because we don't have any other staff as far as dedicated cultural professionals. I am an archaeologist by training. Sarah is too, and and happy to be here. Our first presenter is going to be Corinna Welzenbach. We have a talk called "How to Determine if a Tree is Historically Significant," and I will let you take it away.
Thank you. And can you hear me and see my screen?
We can hear and see you, and your talk looks good.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about how to determine the age of the tree, and that will help someone who's doing analysis of a cultural landscape determine if that tree dates from the historic period and is culturally significant. So I'm going to specifically talk about the old apple tree that used to be located within Vancouver National Historic Reserve, which is adjacent to Fort Vancouver and also part of the original land of Fort Vancouver, which was founded by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1824. And a lot of the information in this talk related specifically to the tree came from a history of the tree by NPS historian Robert Cromwell, which is available online if you want to find out more about this tree. The four things that you need to know about for the tree to determine if it's historic are tree location, tree brings, tree genetics, and primary sources. So first of all, tree location. This tree is located across the highway from, on the right is Fort Vancouver, and the yellow circle is where the tree is located. And the green, all of this green is where the historic orchard at Fort Vancouver is located. So the tree was actually not located within the historic orchard. However, archaeology determined that the tree was located adjacent to the employee village that was associated with the fort, and particularly associated with one employee and his family's house. So the tree could have been planted by that family or another family to be used just for their personal use. The next step would be to see if you could take a core of the tree using an increment borer. Unfortunately, with historic apple trees specifically and historic pear trees, a lot of times if they're really old, the trunks are hollow. You can see in the old apple tree at adjacent to Fort Vancouver, the trunk is actually completely hollow. So you could not use an increment borer to determine the age of that tree, but some trees you can. Look at the tree size. So as trees grow, they increase in size. However, they do reach a maximum size, but you can compare the size of the tree to trees that you know the age of that are growing in a similar environment to give you an initial estimate, not an exact number. And for the old apple tree, they tested the genetics of the tree. So this really mostly works for fruit trees to help determine how old they are, because very historic trees, the oldest historic trees are usually seedling trees, which genetic tests determine that the tree at Fort Vancouver was a seedling tree. But if you find that the tree matched a specific cultivar, you could look at when that cultivar was in its peak use to determine if it was a historic tree. Finally, I believe, is the primary sources, which you would use for any standard historic research to find out if there's any documentation such as personal diaries, journals, agricultural records, historic photographs, historic drawings, oral or ethnographic interviews, or nursery catalogs. So for the apple tree at Fort Vancouver, there's a lot of historic documentation of the site. And there's this letter from 1841 that states the apple trees bore a remarkably heavy crop of fruit and were invariably in a healthy condition. There were from 400 to 500 of these in a bearing state. So this describes the orchard, but it also just explains that there were a lot of apples grown adjacent to the fort. And here's another example of a primary source. This was not from the historic period of Fort Vancouver, but it was from 1911. District fruit inspector determined that the fruit tree was historic in 1911 by not of the central leader, but of a branch, and then extrapolating the age of the tree from that. So by looking at the tree location, tree rings, the genetics, and primary sources, the NPS determined that the tree was planted anywhere from 1826 to 1830, and it died in 2020, which made it 190 to 194 years old, which was the oldest apple tree on the West Coast that's known. And knowing the age and the history of the tree will help you understand if the tree is a contributing resource to a historic district and impact the management of the tree. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You stuck exactly to 5 minutes, which is excellent. Also, Fort Vancouver is where our park's historic collections are located. So that transitions nicely into the next talk by Dr. Alison Kyra Carter from the University of Oregon, an associate professor discussing the origins of glass beads from FOVA, Fort Vancouver National Historic Site.
Okay, can you see my screen and hear me?
You sound good.
Okay, and you can see my PowerPoint, I presume. Let's see. Okay, hopefully that is clear. Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm Alison Carter, who's at the University of Oregon, and I'm presenting on a collaborative project that I'm working with Megan Huff from the Fort Vancouver National Historic Site and Laura Dosubia at the Field Museum in Chicago, who's helped with the analysis of these beads. So the Fort Vancouver was the administrative headquarters of the Hudson's Bay Company operations in Western North America. This map here shows its location along the Columbia River, and it apparently, reportedly, controlled most of the trade or the fur trade in Western North America, across most of Western North America, and as a result was the major supplier of European goods in this region from 1825 to 1850. Over 100,000 glass beads have been excavated from this site, and these were a key item being traded from Fort Vancouver across British Columbia, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and perhaps even into California and Alaska. Excavations at Fort Vancouver identified beads in these different locations and different locations across the site. I'll show you a map in a couple slides. And they were initially classified by Lester Ross. And then this classification was revised and updated by Robert Cromwell, Flynn Renard, and Elaine Dorset, and published in this guidebook and is also available as a free PDF download from the NPS website. What's really helpful about this is that Lester Ross and then the subsequent guidebook identified these different types of beads that were there, and so it's a helpful comparative resource for other people looking at glass beads, especially in Western North America and the Pacific Northwest. What we wanted to do for our project was extend this by doing compositional analysis of the glass beads that were pictured in this reference guide. While glass beads can look similar to one another or visually similar, they can be made using different glass recipes, and these glass recipes then are associated with different workshops and traditions, places, and time periods. So compositional analysis can tell us what elements are in the glass, and then from there we can extrapolate the glass recipe. The method that we're using is a virtually non-destructive technique called LAICPMS, or laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. This is when you use a laser about 60 microns in size, which is about the width of a human hair, to sample the glass, and then you're measuring the major, minor, and trace elements. We sent the beads to the elemental analysis facility at the Field Museum in Chicago, and my colleague Laura Matthews supervised the analysis of these materials. So we've now completed, we haven't analyzed every single bead in the guidebook because some of them were kind of rare or fragile, and so we didn't want to send them for analysis, but almost all of the beads have been analyzed now from the reference book. And this pie chart here shows you the different glass recipes and the number and then percentage of beads from the reference guide that fall into those glass groups. I'm also putting in here my speculation or interpretation about where I think the glass was produced based on the bead morphology and then the recipes and what we know about known workshop recipes from Europe during the 20th centuries. So what we found is that there's a lot of lead glass. However, when you look at the lead glass, you can actually see there's two distinct groups. One group seems associated with Venetian production, and then another group has a more distinct composition, which we think might have originated in China. Then we have some glass beads that were made with potash and lime recipe, which is associated with Bohemian production. And a lot of these beads are faceted, which is another morphology that we associate with that kind of production. And then we have soda lime glass, which is another recipe that was used by Venetian producers. And then lastly, we have a really small quantity of mixed glass, and some of those seem like they might be made in Bohemia and some in Venice, and that's something I'm still working on. All right, then what I've done recently is take a look at the beads across the Fort Vancouver site. So Lester Ross had used his typology and noted where the number of beads in the different types in the reference guide. And then using that, I associated the number of beads with the different recipes. And what you can see here is that 97 of the glass beads seem to either be made from lead or a soda lime recipe, which we associate with Venetian production. So it seems like most of the beads that were found in Fort Vancouver are coming from Venice. Then we have a very small percentage that are the potash lime beads. Only 11 that I have been able to determine might have been coming from Chinese. And then we have some very small numbers of this mixed glass. And then there's a few glass beads that were polychrome, and they used different types of glass in the beads, and those had multiple different glass types in them. Those all, to me, seem like they're Venetian in that they often had soda lime and lead glasses together. So this has been really interesting just in terms of thinking about where the most of the beads in the Fort Vancouver site and were getting imported into the United States were coming from. This map is from Lester Ross, showing a map of the Fort Vancouver site, and then the shaded boxes are the locations where the beads came from. And then these pie charts here are showing you the different quantities of different colored glass beads, and each of the colors corresponds to the color of the glass. We have red, amber, brown, yellow, green, blue, purple, black, and white or colorless beads. And as you can see, Lester Ross noted that there were some color differences found across the Fort Vancouver site. And he noticed that there were a lot of white and blue beads, which he attributed to a preference for these colors from Native Americans related to their existing white and purple shell glass beads. And then what you can see notably, though, is that in the bachelor quarters privies, there were a lot of yellow beads, which is quite unusual. And he didn't really have an explanation about why there was such a dramatic color difference, too. I don't really have I don't have data yet about what kind of specific bead types were found. I have this color data, but I don't know exactly what kind of beads were found, the different types. And so I'm hoping to get that information, and then we can look and see if there's kind of similar spatial differences in the compositions of beads across the site in relation to the colors as well, too. Our next steps also are to submit this as an article to the open access Journal of Glass Studies so that we can make this data freely available, including the compositional data that people could use. And especially we hope it would be helpful for people looking at contemporaneous sites across the Pacific Northwest and Western North America. And there's a small collection of glass beads at the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History from Oregon and Alaska, and hoping to start with a preliminary study comparing those collections with the Hudson's Bay collection at Fort Vancouver. So that is all I have for now, and thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much. Did not realize there was a volume number 5 for beads. I do have volumes 3 and 4. Oh, wow, you can't even see it. How strange with the blurring feature. But our next speaker is going to bring me to another place that San Juan Island National Park has interest in, which is Ebey's Landing National Historical Reserve, the only national historical reserve in the system. We do have management responsibility for that unit as well. And Natasha Antonova, who is a geographer and GIS specialist for the North Coast and Cascades Network, will be talking about land cover changes at Ebey's Landing from 1963 to 2020. Ooh, Fairy House.
Yeah, can you guys hear me and see the presentation okay?
Looks great.
Great. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Natasha Antonova. I'm the GIS specialist for the North Coast and Cascades Inventory and Monitoring Network. And today I'm presenting on the implementation of the NCCN Landscape Change Monitoring Protocol in one of our smaller parks, Ebey's Landing National Historical Reserve. Let's see if that's the slides. So Ebey's Landing is located on central Whidbey Island, homeland of the Lower Skagit people. And this area experienced a lot of development pressure in the middle of the last century, coming from the urban areas to the southeast. And the community advocated for steps to be taken to slow and better manage the development. So because of these efforts, the reserve was created in 1978. The reserve is a unique partnership between local communities and government agencies and is made up of a combination of private and public lands with a number of conservation easements in place. And those are represented by colorful big blobs on this map. The reserve is managed by the Trust Board with members representing city, county, state, and federal interests, as well as local community members. The main questions we're trying to answer with the study is whether or not the establishment of the reserve helped slow down the development and preserve the rural character of the area. And to do that, we used available aerial photography to document land cover before and after the creation of the reserve and to determine the types of landscape change affecting the area. So based on the available imagery, we ended up with 3 different time steps from 1963 to 1990, 1991 to 2006, and 2007 to 2020. Land cover changes inside and outside the reserve to be able to make a comparison. And we tried to delineate a study area based on watershed boundaries, except on the northeast side here, where we used a county road to cut off the study area to avoid including the larger city of Oak Harbor in the study. So we used Island County parcel data from 2021 as our unit of measure and looked at almost 7,000 parcels inside and outside the reserve. We used publicly available county parcel databases to glean information about the timing and the nature of development for each individual parcel. So a lot of work in looking at aerial photos. So for each parcel, we determined a number of attributes. So first we looked at land cover type using 75% rule. So if the parcel was at least 75% of one cover type, it got assigned that category. If none of the cover types reached 75%, we used the mixed vegetation category. And if parcel contained more than 25% of surface modified by humans, So that includes structures, landscaping, and impervious surfaces. That parcel was labeled as built. Next, we determined the change type between the different time steps. So we used a 10% rule for that, meaning that at least 10% of the parcel had to be modified in order to be assigned as some kind of change, clearing or development or vegetation regrowth. Otherwise, it was a no change label. So we also documented additional flags to be able to catch smaller changes that were less than 10% of the parcel. We have the developed flag, so that those are yes or no flags. So that indicates whether a parcel has any kind of human development or presence. We have structure changes flag that has several categories that indicates whether a building was added or removed or modified, and that was important for cultural resources to determine if historical structures were removed. And then we have agricultural land flag. So those are the lands that clearly visibly used for agricultural purposes. And finally, we're working currently on developing a residential flag, which will assess whether or not the development on the parcel is related to residential and building of houses. So some of the results. Land cover changes, this is within the reserve. We can see the reduction in forest, mixed vegetation, herbs and shrubs categories. They represented about 80% of the area in 1963, and then by 2020, they only represent about 30%, and then you can see that those were replaced by the parcels that have been developed. So again, these are the parcels that have at least 25% of the area covered by human activity. Agricultural areas saw some reduction as well, from about 13% in 1963 to about 3% in 2020. And then this graphic shows types of changes within the reserve. So the types have changed over time. In the earlier time steps, we saw a little bit more of clearing and regrowth, probably related to the forest management practices. And then development category was the biggest change in all the three steps. And so recall that the development, it's the 10% of the parcel was developed, 10 or more. This chart compares the rates of development inside and outside the reserve. So these data are based on the development flag, which is simply, was the parcel developed? So any kind of human modification, including roads, utility structures, landscaping, driveways, barns, would be flagged as developed. So you can see that the rate of development was slower inside the reserve in all three steps. And the rate of increase between the first two times was higher, and then it slowed down recently. So our next steps is to finish assessing residential flag for parcels, which will help us understand how much of the development is actually residential houses and not structures related to agriculture, for example. Then we will conduct additional QA/QC with an independent observer to see the rate with which people assign the similar attributes to parcels, and then we intend to publish the data set to the data store and develop some communication products. We have a draft dashboard that people are able to view different land cover and change types for dates used in time steps, and then also summarize data based on land ownership, either by percent area or the number of parcels. And there had been a lot of folks involved in this project. So I'd like to thank the interns who spent weeks and months staring at aerial photos, and reserve staff and project leads who helped develop the methodology and highlight important questions for the reserve.
Thank you, Natasha. Hazel, this flows very well because we're going from one GIS focused kind of into another GIS specific session or talk rather with GIS intern Dan Teller from Lewis and Clark National Historical Park, a gorgeous corner of the country. Dan's going to be talking about visualizing legacy data, which I'm sure all of us have dealt with at some point in time in our careers.
Uh,
Thanks, Dan.
oh, hi, I'm Dan Teller. Let me share my screen. And let's see. Okay, can you see my screen?
Looks great.
Okay, wonderful. And okay, hi. This is visualizing legacy data at Lewis and Clark National Historical Park, apologies. And I'm Dan Teller. I have a BS in GIS and a BA in anthropology. I'm currently a graduate student at ASU. And that's me with one of my personal heroes, Sacagawea. It's really great to actually go and see a statue of her. And this is Fort Clatsop, and it's where Lewis and Clark spent the winter before making the return trip home in the spring. It's just outside of Astoria, Oregon, where the Goonies is filmed. It's a very popular and beautiful park and has been the site of extensive excavations going back to 1948. And the project that was assigned to me was georeferencing old site plan map images and working with the park's legacy data and converting it into modern geodatabase feature classes inside a file geodatabase complete with metadata and spatial reference. And as a GIS professional, we operate in a data-driven culture. We are taught to treat data as an asset, and that good metadata is a requirement that provides a huge return on the investment of time and effort. And what is legacy data? Legacy data is older GIS data formats are being phased out or already out of use. They can be real headache to work with on modern hardware and software. Examples of legacy data are AutoCAD files, shape files, coverages, Microsoft Access databases, also known as personal geodatabases, and old site plan maps. And these are the many advantages of a file geodatabase. And the file geodatabase is now the go-to gold standard for storing and managing GIS data. An Esri file geodatabase is a good overall choice for single users or small groups, as a host of advantages such as easier data migration, larger storage capacity than personal geodatabases, and fewer size limitations such as a larger file name size and a longer naming length for feature classes and attribute fields, and has optimized performance, improved editing model that does not lock down the whole geodatabase with simultaneously making edits, and users can still read the geodatabase while making edits, and you can store raster images in a geodatabase. And file geodatabases also allow for better data compression and the ability to read the data while it's compressed inside a zip folder. And you go, sometimes we get vector data that has no spatial reference. We must use the defined processing tool to assign spatial reference, and this can be real tough to nail down. And this is just my flow chart and how I went about trying to figure things out. And what I do is open a lot of new map frames, set the coordinates as the most likely options, and see what map frame it draws correctly in. After I had the shapefile with spatial reference assigned, I was then ready to export the features and project everything into a standard coordinate system. In this case, NAD 83 Universal Transverse Mercator Zone 10. And next is adding the NPS core metadata fields and assigning domains to the feature classes at the individual record level. After that was done, I was ready to start filling in the metadata at the record level and feature class level. I consulted the associated literature and filled out everything the best I could, making sure everything I did was documented. And once the metadata is done, I would start on the next shapefile with no spatial reference. And I was also that's what I really liked the most was georeferencing. And georeference is taking a digital image and overlaying it in GIS software, and it's showing up in the right place and scaling properly if you zoom in or out. When I first added the image, it showed up in what we in the GIS field call null island at 0 degrees latitude and 0 degrees longitude because I had no spatial reference assigned to it. Then I opened the georeference tool. I had it display in the general area I was looking at. And then I would rotate the image to help me when I started adding the control points. And control points are ties between the pixel on the image to a good known location. I use the corners of the fort and the a known bridge location to add my control points. And this is a finished transformation. And 3 control points is the minimum amount for georeferencing. You can add more control points for a second order transformation and a third order transformation. That's 6 for a second order and 8 for a third order transformation. And this is the finished georeferencing image that now overlays what's supposed to and scales when I zoom in or out. And uh, here are some tips for georeferencing and working with messy legacy data. When scanning maps that you're working with, scan them in the maximum available resolution. And when trying to figure out spatial reference to undefined data, trial and error with lots of map frames is the best way I know how. And always read the site reports and associated literature before you start. And use an Excel spreadsheet to track the status of the files and record problems and operations that you performed, and fill out all the metadata fields so your work can be documented and be authoritatively cited and used again. And thank you. Stop sharing.
Thanks, Dan. I have been to Null Island many times, so I love georeferencing, so that makes a lot of sense. Hey everybody, we have now transitioning to archaeologist Katy Perrier from Olympic National Park, who's going to be talking about one of archaeology's favorite subjects, the toilet. We do love privies, but protecting cultural resources in wilderness. Well, let's see how this yeah, okay, we got a little laughing, crying emoji in the chat. Thanks, chat. Yeah, thanks. Take it away, Katy.
Thank you. I hope you all are ready for some potty talk right now. Hi, my name is Katy Perrier. I am the term archaeologist at Olympic National Park. Today, I'll be talking about an unexpected method we have implemented to protect our cultural resources here at the park. In my career as an archaeologist, I have experienced protecting cultural resources from common threats, including looting, erosion, construction, fire, and just high visitation in general. But it wasn't until I came to Olympic that I encountered how the management of human waste in the wilderness is so important in protecting cultural resources.
Katie, you don't have slides up.
No. Shoot. Sorry, I jumped the gun there. All
I just
right.
wanted to see your visuals.
The visuals, yes, the visuals are important. Okay, let's see.
Perfect.
Okay, so yes. Shoot. Sorry, trying to get reoriented here. Okay, so human waste in wilderness is an important factor in protecting cultural resources at Olympic. This graph shows the total recreation visits for Olympic National Park from 1934 to 2023, generally showing visitation going up. As everyone knows, national parks have become much more popular in the last few years for several reasons. And a lot of times the existing infrastructure can't accommodate the number of visitors that parks are now receiving. At Olympic, this has been especially noticeable in highly visited wilderness areas where bathroom options are already limited. Managing this issue in the wilderness presents us with unique challenges because we cannot use traditional toilets. So historically, this has meant that privies are the best alternative in the context of wilderness. This first photo shows where a large pit has been dug, which is the base of a new privy. The second shows the front of an older version of a wooden privy structure. Inside, these privies would have a traditional toilet throne and seat, but it is essentially a hole in the ground that is functional until it fills up, and a new hole needs to be dug and nearby, with the previous privy hole being covered and the structure moved. With the reality of higher visitation, new privy holes need to be dug much more often. This becomes untenable in areas where there are only a few viable locations due to several environmental factors, but especially being located near known significant archaeological sites or in areas that have a high probability of finding archaeology with ground disturbance. To sum it up, the more privy pits we dig in these areas, the more likely we are to come across and disturb non-renewable archaeological resources, which can have numerous major ramifications. It should be noted that this issue also affects natural resources and landscapes that are culturally important to our affiliated tribes. Last year at Science Days, Dr. Laura Jacobs from Michigan State University did a great presentation titled Level and Extent of Human Waste-Related Disturbance on Two Beaches in Olim. I highly recommend you watch that if you're interested in learning more about it. It's super interesting and a little scary. So in consultation with our tribes, the park implemented a new wilderness toilet design called a urine diverter or a urine separator. As you can see in the picture, this design consists of a normal toilet structure or house that looks very similar to some of our newer privies with different technology inside and some additions. The structure itself has a more modern aesthetic with cedar board siding and a short compost bin attached to the back with a separate lid. On the inside, the setup looks very typical with a toilet throne and a pedal on the side, but the internal mechanism is the highlight, as you can see in the design depiction, where there's an angled conveyor belt that allows liquids to flow down and out to a small drain field. The user must press the pedal to move the solids up the conveyor belt where it is deposited into the compost bin. There's still ground disturbance with this design because of the required drain field, but this is a long-term solution and there's much less disturbance overall than with privies. So here's the first system that was constructed in the park. The first shows a profile view of the structure with the compost bin at the back, and the second shows what it looks like on the inside. Since 2020, we have built 3 of these in the park. The biggest learning curve was the increase in regular maintenance required to keep it functional. The system has to be regularly cleaned. Part of that includes flushing it with water. During peak season, the solids can build up quickly and must be raked back as much as once a week to ensure it composts better, which is necessary before removal. It was estimated that the composted solids would have to be flown out every 3 to 5 years, and we did that last fall with about 350 pounds flown out. From the unit that was built in 2020. As with most toilets, non-compostable garbage becomes an issue with staff having to retrieve it and dispose of it properly, but signage has been installed to educate visitors about this. We've gotten positive feedback from the public. We're currently working on a plan to replace older toilet designs with urine diverters around the park in culturally sensitive areas, but also in locations where daily use is too high for the capacity of a privy according to new EPA regulations. From an archaeology perspective, this project has successfully protected sites from this potential disturbance into the foreseeable future, and it helps preserve an area that is culturally significant to our tribes who have subsistence and cultural treaty rights to their ancestral lands. While I have focused on cultural resources today, this issue is a complex one that balances a wide range of considerations that factor into our management strategies. These considerations include, but are not limited to, health and safety for staff and visitors, maintaining the character of wilderness, impacts to surrounding natural resources and the landscape itself, and growing staffing and program needs, while also complying with the laws and regulations and holding true to our mission at the NPS. Thank you. All right.
Thanks, Katy.
Yes.
Yeah, air support for that is probably nice, I imagine. At Rocky Mountain National Park, the wilderness crew has a support string of llamas that they bring up to tend to the wilderness urine diverter toilets up there. Fun fact, I don't know any other parks that have a llama crew. If you do, let me know. Our final lightning talk in this session will be from Laurie Matthews, who is the Director of Preservation Planning and Design and Adjunct Professor of Landscape Architecture and Historic Preservation at University of Oregon, talking about expanding preservation's role in mitigating climate change through a cultural landscapes framework.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing with cultural landscapes and climate change. I'm going to highlight a few strategies today about managing or kind of balancing the management of the character with climate change impacts and conditions, and how some of those strategies actually may mitigate some of climate change's impacts, looking at water, wildfire at a couple different scales, and increasing resiliency overall in case studies at North Cascades, Crater Lake, and Fort Vancouver. So visiting a few places we've already been to this morning. The first one I'm going to look at is flooding and stormwater management at North Cascades and Marble Mount District. And what we have here is this is an existing conditions plan, and it shows that what you can't see here is there's a huge hillside on the northwest side of this where the water flows into the site. And historically, actually, they had put in, there's a creek, a natural creek that had some infrastructure put in, and also a drainage ditch that had been installed during the period of significance that were addressing some of that flow. But as you can see, both of those are not really functioning as they were historically. And so some of the recommendations, as you can see here, this is all in the upper kind of left-hand side of the plan, were to reinvigorate those features in particular, which then increases the resiliency of this site to address stormwater and kind of increased flood events. We can look at this, we use this kind of methodology at a larger landscape scale to recommend installing wetlands and doing kind of upper watershed development on larger sites as well. So it's a strategy that can be scaled up and down. The next one I'm going to look at is wildfire, and we're going to look at it at two different scales. One at the landscape scale. Again, we're staying here at the Marble Mount Ranger Station in North Cascades. And this is a period plan, something that we do that relies on historic research to develop an understanding of what the site looked like. Here is at the end of the period of significance in 1965. And when you compare this to what is there today, how much the vegetation, it was a much more open and less had less trees within the core of the site, and over time that has increased in scale and number and getting really close to some of those buildings. So we want to try to increase the defensible space. And so this is actually a situation where we can restore some of the historic character of the site and also prevent or can increase kind of defensible space around the buildings. You will see in this case, we've actually removed or recommending removal of some of the trees on the right-hand side, which are around the residences. And we're also looking at moving the forest edge on the west side or the left side, increasing that capacity as well. One of the things that we also look at in terms of this is species. So there are a lot more conifers in the forest on the left. And so there's a priority to remove some of the conifers or kind of prioritize the removal in both places to create a little bit more defensible space. Staying at North Cascades, we're actually going to look at this one from a site scale perspective, both here at Marble Mount and also at Crater Lake. And the recommendations that we make for this at the site scale, where we're right around the buildings, is can be kind of higher level, like we're seeing here. And you can see that we've identified the various fire-wise zones on the right, the immediate zone, the intermediate zone, and extended zone, and those are mapped out on the plan. So people have a sense of what those are, and respond to a variety of recommendations for different types and species of vegetation. So we look at forbs, shrubs, and trees, and each one has a corresponding kind of zone that we want to keep away from the buildings. But one of the things, as many know, is that one of the kind of major tenets of the National Park Service was to create this blend of the landscape with the buildings so that they look kind of more seamless. You can see here where that was employed around the administrative building. And it utilizes a lot of different types of species, but even today that has overgrown. And so the increased kind of scale and type of species has grown. One of the things we also look at is that same kind of consideration in terms of species type. You can see on the upper left, there's a juniper, and that has a highly volatile oil, so it's more flammable than some other species. So we have developed in a lot of these cases a list of species that have a lower flammability quotient, which can be used in a rehabilitation approach to scale back the plantings around the various buildings. How we do that actually is a technique. I'm going to bring you to Crater Lake and show you how we've done that at a more detailed scale. This is a 1949 period plan showing around the Munson Valley headquarters. And it shows, again, how the plantings were right around the base of the main buildings to try to blend the built features into the landscape. You can see here a late 1940s image kind of showing how that was implemented on the site. So how do you continue to create that or have that character of the vegetation around the buildings, but still create a defensible space? In this case, we actually did more detailed planting plans and so kind of show the plants away from the building. We also put around a defensive space, a 5-foot barrier. It can be either decomposed granite or stone or rock, depending on the actual location of the site, and then actually went through and created a planting plan where we talked about putting shrubs near the corners and kind of further away from the building, and using forbs or perennials and such closer to the building, which are a little bit less flammable. So using strategies in terms of moving the plants away from the building, but also using different species types that either that can kind of create that character, but also have that kind of variety of planting material. And a lot of times we are utilizing native plants in these scenarios, but not always. We're trying to balance historic character with kind of the native species that we're seeing. And finally, kind of looking even broader scale at climate adaptation techniques. This is Fort Vancouver. We've been here a couple times this morning already, and this is a period plan showing some of the early development. What you can also see here of the fort is how it is placed within what was a Oakland oak savanna and prairie. And so that was actually the inspiration for trying to understand how we can increase the resiliency of this particular landscape. And because it really dominated the area in the early portion of the site. Still evident, you can see some of the oak remnants. You can see large areas that are grassland all the way up through 1973. And even today, you can still see remnants of that earlier landscape type, even within some of the more developed areas like the East Barracks here, where there's a lot of buildings that were developed during the US Army period. So how we utilize that as an inspiration to bring back a landscape type that has greater resiliency, that evokes some of the character of the earlier site. And there's actually a lot of opportunity to insert this in various places on the site. The area around Fort Vancouver, the area in the East Barracks, and then again between the area around Fort Vancouver and where the visitor center is today. All of those, even though each area has a different kind of character based on kind of the period that is most evoked in terms of the built structures, all of them have an opportunity to increase the level of kind of wetland, oak, savanna, and prairie character. There is the most opportunity, I would say, around Fort Vancouver, especially to the west, to the south, and to the east. And it also evokes or has the most connection to what that landscape looked like during the period of the fort itself. And this is kind of what we think it will look like, where you have a slightly different management technique. You're using a variety of natives that kind of give that field, that cultivated field look. But you can see just on the edge here where it can be mowed, so you can have a little bit more formal character that would be more appropriate in around the East Barracks and the area between the fort and the visitor center. But it also blends very well with very formal landscapes. This is Ham House in London, where in a lot of places in England, they're using this technique not only to decrease maintenance regimes, but also to increase biodiversity. So it has multiple wins on various levels. And with that, I will end my talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laurie. At this point in time, if you saw in the chat, we're going to ask the speakers to come back on camera. We have a little bit of time for a question and answer session. And folks, if you want to drop your questions into the chat, we will be able to go through those. I have one first one that has already come in, and this can be answered by anyone. It's for any of the presenters. We are wondering how your study incorporated traditional knowledge into the results and findings from your research. If anyone wants to go ahead with that.
I would say that for Fort Vancouver, the climate adaptation strategies, we use a lot of traditional ecological knowledge, especially in terms of prioritizing some of the plant species that we're recommending, not only for the resilience that they will be able to deal with higher precipitation and temperature, but also for potential access by tribes who have an association with Fort Vancouver to do foraging. So there's another kind of aspect of increasing the cultural kind of integration and engagement with the landscape, and making sure that that is something that can be done there, which is not happening as much right now.
Emilio, you're muted.
I'm not saying anything interesting anyways. We can come back to that question too if anyone wants to think about how they might have incorporated traditional knowledge. Dan, I had a question for you specifically that came in, which is what stories are you hoping to tell with the data that you've cleaned up?
Well, it's more of any kind of story I like to tell is just the nerdy side of archaeology, trying to actually just tell like the larger kind of like uh, story of like all the excavations that have happened since the 1940s. First, it was actually with Lewis Cawood, and then it was Paul Schumacher, and then after that, we had actually Bob Cromwell leading excavations, and an archaeologist by name of Wilson leading excavations. And with the maps they left behind, these go back before the time of real GIS systems. So the only record we have is their maps, and so it kind of feels important to actually digitize their maps, and actually so we have their actually records of excavation. And so sort of like doing what the georeferencing is, taking those older maps that from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and then being able to actually bring those into the digital era.
Thanks, Dan. Katie, in the chat, we have a Q&A for you from Betsy. This says, great work on the toilets. 2 questions. Are you in touch with the Olympic National Forest staff on this work? If not, do you have something written up that you could send? Because it sounds like they are having similar problems.
Thank you, Betsy, for that question. Not to my knowledge, but I have not been the only person, certainly, to work on this project. It's a lot of different people have worked on this, and before I came to the park, so there may have been some, talks with the Forest Service before, but we do have project proposals, quite a few, that we could share and, go over if you guys need some inspiration. And then I see there's a second question there. Um, with the handle on the toilets. That's very disconcerting that you've almost knocked yourself out with that. I don't know if there's another design for the toilet. It's it's built by a company that, we don't build them ourselves. It's a design that we got from a company that builds them. And I don't know if there's another way of doing it. I mean, it's very like physically mechanical in that every time you push the pedal, it moves the conveyor belt. I'm sure there's some other mechanism that could be used for that, but something that we would have to look into. Yeah.
Panel, I'd also like to open it up to you if you have any questions that you'd like to ask one another as well. Don't think this is only for the chat.
Question for Laurie. Said something about flammability index of plants. Is there a research on that? Like a list of, is that just an estimate?
Corinna, I think you were breaking up a little bit, but I think you were asking me about the species and kind of what our information is about the volatility of plants and the species
where
types.
do you get that information? Yeah.
Yes, I can't recall citation right off the top of my head, but we have been looking at various source material that talk about things like conifers, and we've also been working with people who work in fire, and so actually have firsthand knowledge of seeing, which plants go up in flames faster than others. So some of it is more observational and some of it is empirical. I know that in working in California, eucalyptus trees in particular are highly flammable. A lot of it has to do with the amount of the oil within the plant, either in the leaves or the stems and the trunk. And so that's what we're primarily looking at. But I think there's a lot more opportunity here for study and being even more understanding them in even more detail.
And one more question: what about irrigation systems around the building so that the plants like contain more water within their?
Yes, and that is something else I didn't mention that in the talk, but we are prioritizing plants that do have kind of a more water content quality. I think that's one of the reasons why we have indicated more forbs than we may have done in previous iterations prior to dealing with climate change, but also because they also don't have the same, they die back in the winter, and so you have less kind of woody debris and woody content to them. So yeah, we are looking, and that's why we're prioritizing forbs in particular, closest to buildings or next to buildings.
Thank you all. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A section nor in the chat.